The old man hadn't planned on opening his door that night. At 78 years old, Walter Hayes lived by routine. Dinner at 6, radio at 7, lights off by 9. The house was quiet now, too quiet, some would say. His wife had passed 3 winters ago, and the silence had learned how to settle into every corner of the place. Outside, the wind howled through the trees. Snow drifted sideways under the street lamp, piling against mailboxes and fences. The weather report had warned of freezing temperatures, but Walter hadn't expected it to turn this cruel. He was already halfway down the hallway toward the bedroom when he heard it. A sound, not a knock, not the wind. Something softer, almost pleading. Walter stopped. He turned slowly and listened. There was again a faint scratching at the front door. He frowned. Probably the wind, he muttered to himself. But then came a sound that stopped him cold. A whimper. Walter sighed, the kind of sigh that carried years of stubborn kindness. He grabbed his coat from the hook by the door and opened it just a crack. Cold air rushed in, and there, curled up on the porch steps, was a dog. Medium-sized, thin, shaking so hard its legs barely held it upright. Its fur was matted with snow, and one ear drooped lower than the other. The dog looked up at him. Its eyes weren't wild. They were tired. Walter knelt down slowly, joints protesting. "Well, I'll be damned," he whispered. The dog didn't bark, didn't run. It simply stared at him, tail giving a weak thump against the frozen wood. Walter looked up and down the empty street. No koya, no owner calling, no car lights, just snow and silence. He hesitated. He knew better. He wasn't supposed to bring strays inside. The house wasn't set up for it. But then the dog tried to stand and collapsed back onto the porch with a soft cry. That decided it. "All right," Walter said quietly. "Just for the night." He opened the door wider. The dog limped inside, hesitating at the threshold as if waiting for permission. Walter closed the door behind them. Inside, the warmth wrapped around the dog instantly. It let out a long, shaky breath and lowered itself onto the rug by the heater. Walter fetched an old towel, dried the snow from its fur, and placed a bowl of water on the floor. The dog drank like it hadn't had water in days. "You're safe now," Walter said, though he wasn't sure who he was saying it for. Later that night, as the wind battered the windows, Walter lay awake in bed listening to the soft rhythm of breathing from the living room. For the first time in a long while, the house didn't feel empty. The next morning, Walter would wake to a sound far louder than a whimper. A knock. Firm. Official. And it would change everything he thought he knew about the dog sleeping by his heater. Walter woke to the sound slowly, as if it were pulling him out of a deep lake. Knock. 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 Not loud, but deliberate. He blinked, disoriented, staring at the ceiling as the sound came again. This time, sharper. Walter pushed himself upright and glanced at the clock on the nightstand. 6:12 a.m. Too early for neighbors. Too firm for a delivery. The house was still dark, the gray-blue light of early morning barely seeping through the curtains. Then he heard it. The dog. A low, uneasy growl, not aggressive, just alert. Walter swung his legs over the side of the bed, heart beating a little faster now. "Easy, boy," he whispered as he shuffled down the hallway. The dog stood near the front door, body tense, ears lifted. It glanced back at Walter, then returned its gaze to the door, tail low. Walter peered through the small window beside the door. His breath caught. A police cruiser sat at the curb, lights off but unmistakable. 2 uniformed officers stood on his porch. One male, one female. Walter opened the door slowly. "Yes," he said, his voice rough with sleep. "Good morning, sir," the female officer said politely. "Are you Walter Hayes?" Walter nodded. "I am." The male officer glanced past him, eyes narrowing slightly. "Sir," he said, "do you have a dog inside your home?" Walter felt his stomach tighten. "Yes," he replied cautiously. "A stray. Came in last night. It was freezing." The officers exchanged a look. "May we come in?" the female officer asked. Walter hesitated only a second, then stepped aside. The dog backed up a few steps, but didn't run. It stood its ground, watching the officers carefully. The male officer crouched slightly, studying the dog. "That's him," he said quietly. Walter frowned. "Him," he repeated. "You mean you know this dog?" The female officer nodded. "We've been looking for him all night," she said. "Actually, so has half the county." Walter's heart sank. "Oh," he said. "I am sorry. I didn't know he belonged to anyone." The male officer shook his head. "It's not that simple," he said. The dog took a step forward, then stopped, eyes locked on the officers. For a moment, Walter thought it might bolt, but instead the dog sat down. Perfectly. Still. The female officer's eyebrows lifted slightly. "That's interesting," she murmured. Walter noticed it too. Stray dogs didn't usually sit like that. Didn't hold eye contact. Didn't stay calm around strangers in uniform. "Sir," the male officer said carefully, standing up. "Where exactly did you find him?" "On my porch," Walter replied, shaking half to death. The officer nodded slowly. "Do you mind if I ask, did he make any noise during the night? Barking? Whining?" Walter shook his head. "No, slept like a rock." The female officer smiled faintly. "He always did," she said. Walter's confusion deepened. "Always did?" he asked. The male officer exhaled through his nose and finally looked Walter straight in the eye. "Sir," he said, "the dog you took in last night isn't just a stray." Walter felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold outside. "That dog," the officer continued, "is a retired police canine." And before Walter could even process the words, the dog stood up, walked straight to the male officer, and gently pressed his head against the officer's knee. The room went quiet. Not the comfortable kind of quiet Walter was used to, but the kind that made the air feel heavier. The male officer froze as the dog leaned into him, tail wagging slowly, deliberately. Not excited, not frantic, familiar. "Well, I'll be," the officer whispered. He knelt down without thinking, one hand hovering in the air as if afraid the moment might break if he moved too fast. The dog looked up at him, and then he licked the officer's hand. The officer let out a shaky breath and laughed softly. "Yeah," he said under his breath. "It's you." Walter watched the scene unfold, his confusion giving way to something deeper. "You know him," Walter said. The officer nodded, swallowing hard. "His name's Rex," he said. "Retired canine. Search and rescue. 10 years on the force." The female officer smiled gently. "He disappeared yesterday afternoon," she added. "Slipped out of his handler's yard during the storm." Walter looked down at the dog, Rex, and suddenly saw things he hadn't noticed before. The way he sat, the discipline in his posture, the quiet awareness in his eyes. "He didn't act like a stray," Walter said quietly. "No," the male officer agreed. "He never would." The officer stood and finally looked around the room. "You did the right thing, sir," he said to Walter. "If he'd stayed outside much longer in that cold." He didn't finish the sentence. Walter cleared his throat. "Where's his handler now?" he asked. The female officer's smile faded just a little. "At the hospital," she said. Walter's chest tightened. "What happened?" The officers exchanged another glance, this one heavier. "Heart attack," the male officer said. "Yesterday morning. He's stable now, but Rex doesn't know that." Walter looked back at the dog. Rex had moved to the window now, sitting upright, eyes fixed on the street as if waiting for something or someone. "He never left," Walter murmured. The female officer nodded. "He probably went looking for him. When he couldn't find him, he found you." Walter felt something warm and painful bloom in his chest. "You can take him," he said quickly. "Of course. He belongs with his handler." The male officer hesitated. "That's why we're here," he said. "But before we do, there's something you should know." Walter looked up. The officer continued. "Rex didn't just wander off," he said. "He walked almost 5 miles. Through snow. Past dozens of houses." Walter blinked. "Why mine?" The officer smiled softly. "Because K9s are trained to look for safety," he said. "Light. Warmth. Calm." He looked around the modest living room. "And because you left your porch light on." Walter swallowed hard. Rex turned away from the window and walked back to Walter, sitting at his feet. For a brief moment, Walter placed his hand on the dog's head. "Good boy," he whispered. The dog looked up at him, eyes steady. But Rex still didn't move toward the door. And that's when the female officer realized something. "He's not ready to leave," she said. Walter's heart skipped. "What do you mean?" The male officer watched Rex closely. "He's waiting," he said, "for permission." Rex stayed exactly where he was, sitting, still, alert. The front door stood open, cold air drifting in from the porch. The officers waited patiently, giving the dog space. But Rex didn't step forward. Instead, he looked up at Walter. The male officer let out a slow breath. "He won't leave without a command," he said quietly. "Not after all these years." Walter felt his throat tighten. "So what happens now?" he asked. The female officer answered gently. "Normally, we'd transport him back to his handler's home. But right now, his handler isn't there." Rex turned his head toward the sound of her voice, ears lifting, then went back to watching Walter. Walter knelt down slowly, joints aching, until he was level with the dog. "You're waiting for him," Walter said softly. Rex's tail thumped once against the floor. The male officer nodded. "They form bonds stronger than most people understand," he said. To Rex, his handler didn't just disappear. "He's missing." The words hit Walter harder than he expected. Missing. Not gone. Not lost. Just not home yet. Walter glanced at the officers. "How long has he been with his handler?" he asked. 8 years, the female officer replied. "Every day. Training. Deployments. Searches. Rescues." Walter looked back at Rex. 8 years of loyalty didn't vanish overnight. "I don't mind him staying," Walter said suddenly. "For now. Until his handler's better." The officers were quiet for a moment. "You do that?" the male officer asked. Walter smiled faintly. "I've lived alone long enough to know what waiting feels like," he said, "and he doesn't belong in a kennel." Rex stood up slowly and pressed closer to Walter's leg. The female officer's eyes shone. "That might be the best place for him," she said. The male officer nodded. "We'll need to check with K-9 Command," he said, "but I don't see a problem." Rex finally looked toward the door again, but this time he didn't go to it. He went to the rug by the heater, lay down, and rested his head on his paws, as if deciding this was where he'd wait. Walter watched him, heart heavy and full all at once. Later that morning, after paperwork was signed and phone calls made, the officers prepared to leave. "We'll be in touch," the female officer said. "And thank you, Mr. Hayes." "Truly." Walter nodded. "You tell his handler," he said, voice steady, "that Rex is safe." She smiled. "We will." The door closed. The house grew quiet again, but it wasn't empty. Rex lifted his head and looked at Walter. And for the first time since the knock at dawn, Walter realized the dog hadn't just been looking for shelter. He'd been looking for someone who understood how to wait. 3 days passed. The storm cleared, but the cold lingered, leaving the world wrapped in pale sunlight and brittle silence. Walter and Rex settled into a quiet rhythm, as if they'd been doing it for years. Rex woke early, always early. He'd sit by the front window just before dawn, watching the street with unwavering focus. Not anxious, not restless, waiting. Walter brewed coffee and spoke to him like an old friend. "You'll hear him before I do," Walter said one morning, setting a bowl of food down. "You always do." Rex ate politely, slowly, every habit disciplined, every movement measured. Later that afternoon, Walter heard a car pull into the driveway. Rex was on his feet instantly. Not barking, not running, just alert. Walter peered through the window. A dark sedan, government plates. The same female officer stepped out, this time alone. Walter opened the door before she could knock. "Good afternoon, Mr. Hayes," she said softly. "May we come in?" Rex stood behind Walter, body tense but controlled. "Of course," Walter replied. She knelt as soon as she stepped inside. "Hey, Rex," she said quietly. The dog approached her, sniffed once, then sat. Professional. Respectful. She smiled, then looked up at Walter. "His handler wanted me to come personally," she said. "He's awake." Walter felt his chest tighten. "How is he?" he asked. "Weak," she admitted, "but stable." He asked one question when he woke up. Rex's ears lifted. He asked if Rex was safe. Walter swallowed. Well, he asked. I told him the truth, she said. That Rex found someone kind. She reached into her jacket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. He wrote this, she said. For you. Walter hesitated before taking it. The handwriting was shaky but deliberate. Thank you for giving my partner a place to wait. Walter folded the note carefully and placed it on the table. The officer stood. There's something else, she said. The doctors say it'll be a long recovery. Months at least. Walter looked at Rex, who had returned to his place by the window. So he stays, Walter said. She nodded. Yes, if you're still willing. Walter didn't hesitate. I am. Rex turned toward him. For the first time, his tail wagged freely. That evening, Walter sat in his armchair while Rex lay at his feet, one paw resting lightly against Walter's shoe. The radio played softly. Outside, the streetlights flickered on. Walter looked down at the dog and smiled. Looks like we're both waiting, he said. Rex closed his eyes, and for the first time since the storm, he slept deeply. That night, Rex dreamed. Walter could tell. The dog's legs twitched softly, paws moving as if tracing invisible paths across the rug. His breathing changed, slower, then quicker, caught between memory and instinct. Walter watched from his chair, the glow of the lamp soft against the walls. He didn't wake him. Some things, he felt, needed to be remembered. Rex stirred and let out a low sound. Not a whimper, not a bark. Something in between. The sound of effort, of focus. In his dream, Rex was younger, stronger. The world smelled sharper then. Pine forests, cold rivers, fresh earth disturbed by hurried footsteps. He remembered commands given in calm, steady tones. Hand signals. Trust. He remembered finding people. A child lost in the woods, curled beneath fallen branches. A hiker injured on a mountain trail, breath shallow, hope fading. An elderly woman trapped in her car after a winter crash. Every time, Rex had done the same thing. He found them. He stayed. He waited until help arrived. And always, his handler had been there at the end. A hand on his collar. A quiet good boy spoken like a promise. Rex shifted in his sleep, ears flicking. This time, the memory was different. This time, his handler hadn't come. The storm. The sirens. The empty house. Rex had searched every room. Every corner of the yard. No command. No familiar scent. So he did what he was trained to do. He looked for safety. Warmth. Light. A place where waiting made sense. Walter. Rex woke with a start and lifted his head. The room was dark except for the lamp. The house quiet. Still. Walter sat there, just as he had been before. Rex stood and walked over, placing his head gently against Walter's knee. Walter rested his hand on Rex's head without thinking. It's all right, he said softly. You're here. Rex stayed there for a long moment, breathing steady again. Outside, the wind brushed against the windows, but it no longer felt threatening. Rex returned to his spot by the heater and lay down. Waiting didn't feel so heavy anymore. Because this time, he wasn't waiting alone. The phone rang just after noon. Walter was in the kitchen, carefully slicing apples into a bowl while Rex lay nearby, eyes half closed but alert as always. The sound startled them both. Rex lifted his head instantly. Not anxious. Focused. Walter wiped his hands on a towel and picked up the receiver. Hello. Mr. Hayes? A familiar voice asked. Yes. This is Officer Miller. We spoke a few days ago. Walter straightened. Yes, of course. Is everything all right? There was a pause on the line, just long enough to matter. I'm calling because Rex's handler asked for you, she said gently. Walter felt his chest tighten. He did. Yes, she replied. He's being transferred out of intensive care today. He's weak but stable, and there's something he wants to do, if you're willing. Walter glanced down at Rex. The dog had stood up now, ears forward, tail perfectly still. What is it? Walter asked quietly. He wants to see Rex, Officer Miller said. Not at the station. Not later. Today. Walter closed his eyes for a moment. I understand, he said. Tell me where. The hospital parking lot was crowded, but Rex knew exactly where he was. The moment Walter opened the car door, Rex stepped out and stopped, nose lifted, breathing deep. The scent was there, faint but unmistakable. Rex pulled gently toward the entrance. Inside, nurses paused. Conversations lowered. People turned to watch as the dog walked calmly beside Walter, leash loose, posture proud. Officer Miller met them at the elevator. "He's on the 3rd floor," she said softly. "Private room." The doors opened with a soft chime. As they walked down the hallway, Rex slowed, then stopped. He sat. Walter felt his throat tighten. The door at the end of the hall was slightly open. Officer Miller nodded. "That's him." Walter knelt beside Rex. "You ready?" he asked. Rex stood. Inside the room, machines hummed quietly. Sunlight filtered through the blinds. A man lay in the bed, older than Walter had imagined, face pale, but eyes open. The man turned his head, and then, "Rex," he whispered. The dog crossed the room in 3 silent steps and rested his head gently against the bed. The man's hand shook as it reached out, fingers brushing Rex's fur. "Good boy," he said, voice breaking. "You waited." Rex's tail wagged once. Slowly. Steady. Walter stood near the door, heart heavy, giving them space. "I knew you'd be safe," the man murmured. "I just didn't know where." Rex stayed, as he always had, waiting, until he didn't have to anymore. Rex didn't leave the bedside right away. He stayed there, chin resting gently on the edge of the mattress, eyes fixed on the man who had once been his whole world. The machines hummed softly, nurses moved quietly in and out, and time seemed to slow down just enough to matter. The handler's breathing steadied. His hand remained on Rex's head. "I'm sorry," the man whispered. "I didn't mean to leave you." Rex didn't move. He didn't need explanations. He never had. Walter watched from the corner of the room, his hands folded, his heart full in a way he hadn't felt in years. He saw the bond clearly now, not ownership, not duty. Loyalty. After a while, the handler looked up at Walter. "You must be Walter," he said weakly. Walter stepped forward. "I am." "Thank you," the man said, "for keeping him safe." Walter shook his head slowly. "He did the same for me." The handler smiled faintly. "There's something I need to ask," he said. "The doctors say I won't be going home for a long time. And when I do, I won't be the same." Rex lifted his head slightly, listening. "I don't want him waiting alone again," the man continued. "Not like that." He met Walter's eyes. "Would you keep him?" he asked. "Not just for now. For good." The room went still. Walter looked down at Rex. The dog looked back at him, calm, steady, trusting. Walter swallowed. "I can't replace you," Walter said quietly. The handler shook his head. "You wouldn't be replacing me," he said. "You'd be giving him a home." Rex stood, walked over to Walter, and sat at his feet. Perfectly. Waiting. Walter knelt down slowly and placed his hand on Rex's collar. "Well," he said softly, his voice catching just a little, "I suppose we've both waited long enough." Rex's tail wagged, this time freely. The handler closed his eyes, a peaceful smile on his face. "That's my boy," he whispered. Weeks later, Walter and Rex walked the same quiet street where the storm had once raged. The porch lights still glowed every night, not out of habit, but on purpose. Rex no longer waited by the window. He slept soundly by the heater, and Walter no longer woke to silence. Some bonds are formed in years of service. Others, in one cold night, a warm house, and a simple act of opening a door. Because sometimes saving someone doesn't mean finding them. It means giving them a place to stop waiting. End.